My name is Clara Bennett, and I am 23 years old. My parents told me I would never matter, that my dreams were meaningless, that girls like me were only meant to serve. But I learned in secret. And when the world finally saw me, I made them regret ever doubting me. If you've ever been dismissed, underestimated, or told you weren't enough, hit that like button and subscribe. This story is for anyone who's been pushed down and told they don't matter. And tell me, where are you watching from? Drop your city and local time in the comments. I want to know who's listening. My parents had a way of making the world feel impossibly small. The walls of our house, once comforting, seemed to shrink with every word they spoke, every rule they enforced. My father's voice always carried authority, calm and unyielding, and my mother's words were a sharp mirror of it. Girls stay home. Girls serve. Girls don't need an education. Your brother comes first. Each syllable was like a stone, heavy, cold, and deliberate, dropping on my chest, flattening my spirit under the weight of expectations that were not my own. Every day in our house was a careful choreography, one in which Ethan, my brother, was celebrated, guided and nurtured, while I was expected to fade, to shrink, to occupy only the spaces left for me. Ethan was everything I was told I should aspire to be. Intelligent, charming, obedient, the perfect son in the eyes of my parents. Every success, however small, earned applause. Every misstep was corrected with gentle guidance, tutors, and reminders. Never a harsh word. Never a moment of real consequence. And me, I was invisible. I was supposed to be the quiet shadow, the obedient girl whose presence was acknowledged only in its absence. I was expected to sit silently, smile when necessary, obey without question, and accept the life that had already been written for me. But I didn't accept it. Every night, when the house quieted, when my parents' footsteps receded into the distance and the world outside seemed to stop, I found my refuge. The dim light of a flickering candle cast shadows across my room, stretching my imagination and illuminating my notebooks. They were battered, edges curled, pages stained with ink and determination, but they were mine. I clutched them like shields against a world determined to ignore me. The air smelled faintly of old tea and my mother's lavender detergent, a scent that always reminded me of order and expectation, of confinement and control. I opened a borrowed textbook, and the soft scratch of my pen on paper became the rhythm of resistance. I taught myself everything they said I didn't need to know. Mathematics, chemistry, physics, literature, subjects my parents insisted were unnecessary for a girl. I would stay up late, copying formulas until my fingers cramped, memorizing chemical reactions until the letters swam before my eyes, reading lines of Shakespeare until my vision blurred with exhaustion. Every concept I mastered was a small victory, a reclamation of a part of myself that had been dismissed, ignored, and denied. I whispered to the shadows, "One day they will see. One day they will regret underestimating me." Ethan continued his life under the protective canopy of parental guidance. Tutors hovered. Encouragement flowed like a river, and every small achievement earned him applause. My successes, painstakingly earned in stolen hours, went unnoticed. There were no smiles, no proud words, no recognition. I existed in silence, a secret storm building quietly beneath the surface. The first tangible proof of my resilience came unexpectedly. One afternoon, a letter arrived in a plain envelope. I recognized the handwriting immediately. It was from the scholarship committee I had applied to months earlier, after secretly submitting my application online. My hands trembled as I tore open the envelope, my heart hammering in my chest. Inside was a letter confirming a full scholarship, a validation of every night spent hunched over textbooks, every ache in my hands, every moment of isolation. I wanted desperately to run to my parents, to force them to see their mistake. But fear had been drilled into me too deeply. Instead, I tucked the letter into my journal, smiling quietly to myself. That smile was not for them. It was mine, a private celebration of rebellion and triumph. The years passed, and I grew into my education and independence. College became both a haven and a stage, a place where I could cultivate a version of myself they could not touch. I excelled academically, made friends who treated me as an equal, and learned skills they had always assumed were unnecessary for me. I applied for internships, participated in research, attended seminars, and won awards. Every achievement was a brick in the foundation of my life, each one laid in secret, far from the eyes that had always sought to keep me small. Returning home after graduation was surreal. The house smelled the same, the walls unchanged, the carpets worn in familiar ways. But I was no longer the girl who had been invisible. I walked through the familiar halls with quiet confidence, my presence deliberate, measured, and undeniable. My parents' polite smiles were tighter than ever, their eyes searching for the obedient girl they thought they knew. They didn't find her. They approached cautiously, offering rehearsed niceties, assuming I still needed guidance, still required their oversight. "Clara, it's good to have you home," my mother said, voice tinged with something I couldn't identify. Was it pride? Hope? Fear? My father nodded silently, eyes sharp and calculating. I returned their greetings with a calm, controlled smile, my words polite, my posture impeccable. I had no need to argue, to demand recognition. I had built my proof in silence, and now it would speak louder than any confrontation. A family gathering soon followed. My parents were eager to parade their obedient daughter, to showcase me to distant relatives as proof of their proper upbringing. They had expected compliance, modesty, and quiet pride. What they did not expect was that I had grown beyond their understanding, that my achievements were a language they had never learned to read. I arrived in a simple yet elegant dress, posture perfect, eyes calm and observant. The air shifted when I entered the room, not with noise, but with presence. Conversations faltered, glances flicked in my direction. I began to speak naturally, confidently, and the story of my accomplishments unfolded. I described conferences I had attended, research I had led, awards I had won, scholarships I had earned. My voice was steady, calm, each word precise. I did not shout. I did not demand recognition. I let my work speak for itself. The effect was immediate. Heads turned, whispers grew, and my parents faltered, caught off guard by a reality they had never anticipated. They attempted to redirect the conversation, to reassert control, but I offered no script, no opening for them to reclaim dominance. The obedient girl they thought they had molded was gone, replaced by someone who had learned to thrive in spite of them. I watched their faces closely. Shock, disbelief, and something almost imperceptible. Fear. Fear not of the world, but of me, of a daughter they had assumed they could shape and contain. For years they had imagined I would remain small, quiet, and unremarkable. Now they were confronted with the undeniable truth. Their assumptions had been wrong. I had built my life, my successes, my identity entirely outside the walls they thought controlled me. Later, as I lay in the guest room that night, the weight of the evening settled around me. Not heavy, not crushing, but full of quiet promise. I could feel the thrill of anticipation mingling with satisfaction. The first act of revelation had been played, and it had gone exactly as I had hoped. I did not need anger, shouting, or confrontation to claim my victory. Revenge, I understood, was not a performance. It was inevitability, and inevitability was more powerful than any outburst. I whispered to the darkened room, letting my words sink into the corners, filling the silence with quiet triumph. Soon, they will feel every night I spent in silence. Soon, they will understand what it means to underestimate me. They tried to chain my dreams, and all they did was teach me how to fly. Sleep did not come easily that night. My mind spun with possibilities, strategies, and subtle, deliberate ways to unveil the truth. Every slight, every dismissal, every act of invisibility they had cast upon me became a building block in a plan so precise it could not fail. I thought of the scholarships, the awards, the recognition outside our house, and how slowly, inevitably, the walls of my parents' certainty would crumble. The following days were a study in observation. I watched my parents, noting the ways they attempted to reassert control, the small gestures of pride they could not entirely suppress, and the moments when they caught themselves underestimating me again. I allowed these moments to accumulate, cataloging them in my mind, storing them for the eventual reveal that would leave no room for dismissal. Every casual remark, every glance, every attempt at manipulation, I observed silently, knowing the day would come when these too would serve my larger purpose. Ethan remained blissfully unaware. His world was carefully constructed, cushioned from real struggle, and he had never known the discipline of true achievement earned alone. I felt no malice toward him. He was a product of their choices, a pawn in a system I had quietly outmaneuvered. My focus was never on him, but on the quiet, inexorable dismantling of the narrative that had sought to define me. I continued my work, publishing articles, attending more seminars, and cultivating relationships that would further establish my independence and credibility. Each step forward was a testament to years of unseen labor, and with each success, the inevitability of revelation became clearer. I no longer needed to shout or demand attention. The weight of truth would speak for me, louder than any parental voice ever could. One afternoon, weeks later, I received an invitation to present at a prestigious international conference. I held the letter in my hands, imagining my parents' faces when I told them not just what I had accomplished, but how the world now recognized me. Their shock would be a slow, deliberate unveiling, a reflection of every night I had spent proving my worth in silence. I smiled to myself, a private acknowledgement of years of preparation, patience, and perseverance. I had learned to master the art of invisibility, to turn neglect into fuel, to transform dismissal into determination. The obedient girl my parents thought they knew was a myth, a fabrication that had crumbled under the weight of my silent rebellion. And now, armed with undeniable proof of my achievements, I would dismantle that myth piece by piece, not with anger, but with precision, inevitability, and the quiet satisfaction of a plan perfectly executed. As I prepared for the coming weeks, mapping each conversation, each announcement, each demonstration of my independence, I felt a calm certainty settle within me. I had not only survived their control, I had thrived because of it. Every attempt to diminish me had been absorbed, redirected, and repurposed into something greater than they could imagine. And soon, very soon, they would understand. It would not be dramatic. It would not require confrontation. It would be the quiet, devastating realization that their attempts to control me had failed entirely. Every night of silent study, every achievement they ignored, every moment I had been underestimated would culminate in a revelation that could not be ignored. And in that moment, as I imagined their faces, their disbelief, and the slow dawning of understanding, I allowed myself a private smile. Not a smile of vengeance exactly, but a smile of triumph, of justice quietly administered through effort, intellect, and perseverance. The obedient girl they thought they knew had never existed. The real Clara was here, and her flight had only just begun. If the first cracks had appeared in their certainty, the real test was still ahead. I would face setbacks, doubts, and near misses that would sharpen my resolve. Every slight would feed my strategy. Every dismissive glance would fuel my meticulous plotting. The revenge I was building would not just expose them, it would be undeniable. Coming home was supposed to be a victory, a quiet, private moment where I could show them that I had grown into someone uncontainable, someone who could no longer be restrained by their narrow expectations. I had imagined walking through the familiar doors, seeing their faces, feeling the weight of years of silent labor lifting from my shoulders, replaced by the thrill of recognition they could no longer withhold. But life, I quickly realized, has a way of testing patience, and revenge, true, satisfying revenge, is rarely a straight path. It is a labyrinth, full of false turns, delays, and quiet struggles that are invisible to everyone but the person plotting each move. At first, I believed it would be enough to simply appear, to speak with quiet confidence, and let my accomplishments speak for themselves. I imagined that my awards, my research, my small but tangible successes would act like beacons that would force them to acknowledge the person I had become. But the world outside my parents' house was a harsh, unforgiving mirror. Invitations to conferences, while thrilling, brought a new level of intimidation. Networking events were filled with sharp, ambitious people whose eyes measured every detail of my appearance, my speech, my posture, my history. I had spent years mastering knowledge, honing my skills and cultivating intellect. But stepping into these rooms, where expectations were high and scrutiny relentless, felt like walking across a tightrope stretched over doubt and judgment. I learned quickly that intelligence alone could not shield me from evaluation. Perception, strategy, and timing were equally important. And then there were my parents, Coming home, seeing them, was like stepping into enemy territory where every word carried subtle traps. Their casual questions, "What are you doing now?" Or, "Are you sure you'll find work in that field?" were carefully phrased critiques, cloaked in politeness. But each question cut deeper because it carried the weight of years of dismissal. Every time they asked, I felt the tension coil in my chest, my jaw stiffen, and a familiar heat rise behind my eyes. I wanted to snap, to voice the years of frustration, the nights of secret toil, the relentless dismissal of my intellect. But snapping would have been obvious. Subtlety was my weapon and restraint my greatest advantage. I had learned that true power lies not in confrontation, but in deliberate, measured exposure. I remember one evening, during a family dinner, when my father remarked casually, "You'll need to be careful in that career. It's not exactly welcoming to someone without the right connections." His eyes flicked toward Ethan, who offered a polite, nervous smile, basking in the glow of parental approval. I forced a polite laugh, my fingers resting lightly on the stem of my glass. And in that quiet gesture, I felt a thrill. Connections could be built. Knowledge could not be contained. They could control whom I knew superficially, whom I allowed into my social circle. But they could not control the intelligence, skill, and achievements I had cultivated in secret. I realized then that patience, strategy, and timing were more powerful than any argument or emotional outburst I could conjure. Some nights were particularly difficult. I would lie awake in the guest room, staring at the familiar ceiling, replaying every slight, every word of dismissal, every casual shrug that had minimized me for years. The silence of the house pressed against my thoughts like a suffocating blanket. I wondered if they would ever truly see me, if their pride would allow them to acknowledge me as more than a shadow, or if I would always be trapped in the role of the obedient girl they had written into their assumptions. Doubt whispered like a cold wind through the room, asking questions I hated to hear. Am I doing enough? Will they ever understand without a spectacle? Will the years of quiet struggle ever translate into recognition? Or will my victories remain invisible? Then there were the subtle battles with extended family. Relatives would ask Ethan about school, his ambitions, his plans for the future, while my parents beamed, as though the air itself existed only to highlight his successes. When I attempted to mention an award, a research paper, or an internship, they would politely redirect attention back to him, smiling as if nothing had occurred, blissfully unaware of the humiliation their behavior caused me. Every conversation became a quiet battlefield, a test of patience and timing. I learned to listen, to observe, to let the interactions unfold and collect data, cataloging reactions and noting opportunities for the eventual reveal of my successes. Each redirection, each dismissal, only strengthened my resolve. It was exhausting, both physically and mentally. But in those quiet, invisible moments, I began to recognize something profound. The struggle itself was teaching me patience, strategy, and the value of timing. Every subtle slight, every overlooked achievement, every polite shrug was not a setback. It was a step toward the inevitability I had been planning for. The weight of years of dismissal had become fuel, and I was learning to convert it into precision, foresight, and a calculated power that my parents could never have anticipated. I began to plan more carefully, using every interaction as an opportunity to gauge their assumptions, test boundaries, and learn where cracks in their facade might appear. I allowed them to speak, watched relatives ask questions, and quietly noted every hesitation, every unguarded expression. I practiced my responses, the cadence of my speech, the pauses that would maximize impact without ever seeming confrontational. Each word, each carefully crafted comment became a tool in an intricate strategy. One memory stands out vividly. During a family lunch, my father began a story about one of Ethan's minor successes at school. I felt the familiar pang of frustration, an urge to interrupt, to correct, to assert my presence immediately, but I resisted. I stayed calm, listened carefully, and when the story concluded, I added a quiet, measured comment about a research paper I had published, a piece of work so significant that the entire table paused. I saw my mother's eyes flicker with surprise, my father's jaw tighten slightly, and the surrounding murmurs shift. The effect was intoxicating. I had planted a seed of doubt and recognition, subtle but undeniable. Slowly, the groundwork for my eventual complete revelation was forming. The struggle was not only external, it was intensely internal as well. Some nights, lying in bed, I wrestled with guilt. Was I being too calculated? Too cold? Too detached from the family I had been raised in? But then I remembered the years of neglect, the nights spent in isolation, the constant erasure of my intelligence, my diligence, my potential. The guilt melted away, replaced by clarity. This was justice, not cruelty. This was the inevitability of truth finally recognized. My patience was not weakness. It was preparation. My restraint was not submission. It was strategy. Even the near misses became lessons. Invitations I could not attend, articles that went unnoticed, and opportunities that required careful navigation reminded me that timing was everything. Every success had to be orchestrated, every reveal carefully measured. It was like playing chess on a board where my opponents had no idea they were pieces, where every assumption they held became a potential blind spot I could exploit. One wrong move, one miscalculated interaction, could unravel the plan entirely. I had to learn not just to succeed, but to present success at exactly the right moment, in precisely the right way. One evening, I sat cross-legged on the guest room floor, surrounded by notebooks, notes, and plans. I mapped out each relative's awareness, my parents' likely reactions, possible questions, and the carefully measured responses I could offer without revealing too much too soon. My pen moved furiously, each stroke carrying anticipation, strategy, and the thrill of control. I felt my pulse quicken, not with fear, but with the rush of creating something precise, unstoppable, surgical in its execution. I was constructing not just recognition, but inevitability, a moment that could not be denied, ignored, or deflected. And yet, even with all the planning, doubt lingered in the corners of my mind. The quiet moments alone brought whispers. What if they never truly see? What if the world only acknowledges their version of the story, leaving my achievements as footnotes in the shadows? The questions were relentless, but each success I quietly accumulated, each recognition earned beyond their gaze, weighed the scales back in my favor. With every conference I attended, every project I completed, and every award I quietly accepted, I felt the balance shift. The weight of my accomplishments was accumulating, ready to tip over the expectations that had tried to cage me for so long. The quiet, persistent labor of years was transforming into an inevitable revelation, a reckoning delivered not with anger, not with shouts, but with undeniable proof. The obedient girl they had assumed existed had been a fiction. The real Clara was alive, thriving, and building a future entirely of her own making. And I realized something crucial. Revenge was not about dramatic confrontations or loud displays. It was about inevitability. It was about allowing truth to accumulate until denial was impossible. It was about the patient, deliberate orchestration of life in a way that could not be dismissed, minimized, or erased. Every slight, every dismissal, every assumption my parents carried was a piece of the foundation I would use to reveal the truth. Quietly, inexorably, devastatingly, every slight, every dismissal, every small victory I endured or achieved was bringing me closer to the point of no return. The planning was nearly complete, the tension almost unbearable. Soon, I would move from preparation into execution, and my parents, along with the rest of the world, would be forced to reckon with the daughter they had underestimated for so long. The autumn chill settled into the house like a quiet witness, pressing against the windows and making the warm lamplight inside feel smaller, more intimate. It was on one of those chilly evenings that I finally admitted to myself the time for subtlety was reaching its peak. I sat cross-legged in the corner of my bedroom, the carpet rough beneath my knees. Notebooks and journals fanned around me like a battle map. Each page carried a memory, a calculation, a micro-expression I'd noticed, a comment that had landed like a pebble and rippled through my days. What had once been tiny stings, dismissive glances, polite redirections, an absence of pride, had been recatalogued. They were no longer just memories. They were instruments, and I was learning how to play them. I traced the outline of the plan with my finger on a page, feeling absurdly childish and terrifyingly precise all at once. The problem had never been success itself. It had been making that success impossible to ignore. I needed not only to achieve, but to create circumstances where achievement became the only plausible interpretation of my life. I wanted my parents to feel, not just understand. They needed to see, really see, the consequences of their choices. The daughter they assumed would remain small, instead standing steady, unshakable, and finally unignorable. Understanding them was the first step. My father was a man of composure and image. He disliked mess, contradiction, and public awkwardness. He responded poorly to direct confrontation. His reflex was to smooth things over or to steer attention elsewhere. My mother, outwardly warm, had built her identity around the family's perceived respectability. Pride and insecurity twined so tightly in her chest that being seen as successful through her children comforted and validated her. Both could be influenced, but not by fury. They were susceptible to the exact kind of thing they always valued: appearances that matched the narrative they wanted to tell. Except this time, the appearance would be mine. So I began small. I worked the edges of conversations the way a sculptor works marble, chiseling away at assumptions without ever making an obvious strike. At dinners, I'd drop precise, unembellished statements. Last week, I presented a paper at a symposium on renewable materials. I'm collaborating with a lab on analytics for the project. No shouting. No self-congratulation. Just facts laid down cleanly, like tiles forming an inevitable pathway. Each tile forced them, and anyone listening, to adjust the floor beneath their feet. Their reactions were subtle at first. My father's eyes would flicker, an almost imperceptible widening. Then he'd redirect the topic to Ethan as if that could sanitize the moment. My mother would repeat the polite phrase about being so proud, but with a tremor at the edge that betrayed surprise. Micro-expressions taught me more than any lecture. I learned to read the small betrayals: a held breath, a hand pressed too tight to a cup, a pause that stretched awkwardly before being filled with a different story. I collected these moments like proof, storing them in the quiet vault of my mind for later. Public appearances became deliberate maneuvers, where once community events had been arenas of embarrassment. Parents chatting about Ethan's future as if I were a wall. Now they were stages. I accepted invitations to speak at charitable meetings, community panels, anything that put me under a soft light, where people might watch and listen. I discovered how to command a room without theatricality. I answered questions with clarity, cut through vague praise with exact details, and gently redirected conversation toward substance. Neighbors who used to say Clara is very sweet now called me the speaker, or the one doing things with the lab. The shift was almost surgical in its effectiveness. The more others recognized me, the more difficult it became for my parents to pretend otherwise. There were close calls. My parents were practiced manipulators. They sensed when the narrative was tilting away from their control. During one crowded lunch, my mother tried to smooth over a scholarship mention I had made by championing Ethan's spot on the cricket team. The chatter rose like a tide, threatening to drown the small victory I'd just planted. For a moment, heat flared in my throat, an impulse to correct, to insist, but I kept my voice measured. I let the remark pass, then waited. Timing was everything. When the tide ebbed, I dropped a detail so precise, a grant number, the name of an editor who'd solicited my article, that there was no room to redirect without looking absurd. It stung them more because it left no opening for polite denial. I kept artifacts, old letters I'd written as a child, school projects my parents had shrugged off as cute, recommendation emails from professors who had praised my independence. Each document became evidence. At first it felt petty to collect favors and certificates like trophies, but necessity changed everything. When the right occasion arrived, these artifacts would not merely be reminders. They would be incontrovertible proof of a consistent pattern of talent and persistence they had ignored. There were nights when the house felt like a pressure cooker. I'd lie awake and watch the ceiling fan slice slow circles through the dark, replaying scenes over and over. A proud smile withheld at an awards night, a question answered with a shrug, a cousin's polite curiosity that my parents had deflected. Doubts crept in, shivers of worry that the plan might misfire. What if the world outside preferred their version of me? What if their influence, and the networks they boasted about, turned the tables again? I treated these doubts the way I treated a tricky proof: break them down into pieces, calculate the probability, and strengthen the weak spots. Those nights also forced me to confront the moral weight of what I was doing. Was this revenge or justice? The line blurred, I told myself that I wasn't dismantling them because I wanted to hurt them. I was correcting an injustice. Every calculated move was an attempt to realign reality with truth. If that required orchestrating perceptions, then so be it. I had been denied authorship of my own life for too long. Taking it back required intentionality. My relationships shifted too. Friends who had known me in college started to appear in my life in small, practical ways, introducing me to a colleague, forwarding a conference invitation, mentioning my name to a local journalist. I grew a network quietly, intentionally, like vines building a lattice. I learned to accept help and to make it visible only when the visibility advanced the plan. I wasn't interested in spectacle. I was interested in credibility that couldn't be dismissed by a family dinner anecdote. Ethan, bless him, floated through all of this buoyed by parental buoyancy. He was never malicious. He was simply the beneficiary of a system that favored his face. I felt no hatred for him, only a solemn pity. He was a piece on the board, not an adversary. My strategy was never to humiliate him. It was to reveal the consequences of their choices in such a way that blames would become impossible to hide. If he lost any warmth from me, it was because the distance had become necessary to keep the plan clean. The more I moved, the more the plan demanded subtle choreography. I learned to present achievements in palettes, public acknowledgments at community gatherings, quiet mentions at family lunches, formal announcements via social media only when they would be seen by the right people. I synchronized evidence with audiences. An article in an academic journal might not shift neighbors' opinions, but a local radio interview would. A framed award in my parents' living room would be stomped out like a distraction, unless the framed award sat atop the mantel at a dinner where other relatives could see it. The mechanics of perception became a discipline that required as much care as any laboratory protocol. There were practical risks. I declined invitations when poor timing could undermine credibility. I guarded my temper because outrage would make the plan look like pettiness. I kept my life meticulously organized. No scandal, no errant post, nothing to hand my parents a new weapon. Patience stretched and coiled inside me. Each restraint I practiced felt like a brick in the foundation of the eventual reveal, and then, slowly, the world began to tilt in my favor. Neighbors who had once shrugged now asked for my advice about projects. A former professor recommended me to a funding committee. A journalist requested an interview after reading a paper I'd published. Each external affirmation added weight to the narrative I was building, proof from independent sources that could not be chalked up to familial boasting. It was the most satisfying kind of validation, clean, impartial, and unmistakable. One afternoon that winter, a distant cousin called to say she'd seen my name in a magazine's profile of rising academics. The cousin's voice carried a note of surprised respect. She mentioned it casually when she visited a week later, and I watched my mother's face as the phrase landed, an unguarded expression of disbelief that quickly rearranged itself into a mask of composure. That moment, small as it was, felt like a key turning. My patience had orchestrated 1,000 of these small keys. Together they were beginning to open doors that had been bolted for years. I had learned to use silence as well as speech. There was power in letting others speak into the gap and then filling it with fact. When my father tried to maintain control of a conversation by steering it toward Ethan's job prospects, I let him. He would drive the narrative until the room began to nod in the accepted rhythm. Then I would unfold a story, concise, exact, impossible to fold back into the previous script. The contrast between his cozy anecdotes and my crisp realities was damning. You couldn't maintain a narrative in opposition to cold fact without looking, at best, like a person clinging to wishful thinking. And with every strategic reveal, my parents' foundation cracked a little more. It wasn't dramatic. There were no arguments in the street or public humiliations. The change was bureaucratic and domestic. A neighbor asking my mother to recommend me for a panel. An aunt calling to congratulate me and then inadvertently informing other relatives. A local paper including my photo alongside a piece on community leadership. The humiliation, when it came, was small and private. My father's refusal to meet my eyes for a moment at a gathering. My mother's hesitation when a cousin asked who I worked with. These were the micro-tremors that precede an earthquake. They were for me triumphs. Even as the plan gathered momentum, I kept close the artifacts of my ordinary life. The embarrassing essays from adolescence, the clumsy early experiments, the letters that showed how long I had been trying to be seen. One night, flipping through them, I found a drawing I'd made as a child of a bird with wings too big for its body. The caption read, "One day I will fly." I laughed then, a small, private laugh, because the bird had not only learned to fly, it had learned to chart the winds. Patience remained the hardest lesson. So many times I was tempted to accelerate, to force the reveal and taste the immediate sweet burn of victory. I resisted because I understood the arithmetic of consequences. A premature triumph would be easy to dismiss. A measured, cascading revelation would leave no room for denial. Revenge, if we must call it that, was a long, slow arithmetic. It required discipline as much as intelligence. The plan was not an endpoint, but a posture. It shifted my relationship with my parents from one of static roles to one of mutable realities. They could continue to live within their assumptions if they wanted, but the world around them would increasingly contradict what they had told themselves. It was a slow, inexorable correction, the kind that accumulates until denial becomes untenable. On a particularly crisp morning, I sat with a cup of tea and imagined the crescendo. Not an explosion, but a tilting, a pulling of a curtain to reveal a stage already set. I pictured my father's face when he could no longer redirect a conversation, because the evidence sat plainly in front of him. I pictured my mother struggling to reconcile the pride she desired with the realization that she had been blind. I felt no glee at their discomfort. I felt a quiet, stern satisfaction, the kind that comes from having survived and then choosing to insist on being recognized. The crescendo remained distant but palpable. Every small victory, every careful reveal, every ally who mentioned my name in rooms my parents cared about, built it into inevitability. I was no longer waiting for change. I was manufacturing conditions where change was the only honest outcome. The plan had stopped being about revenge in the petty sense. It had become a reclamation of truth. When the day finally came for the first formal recognition, a plaque installed in the university hall, acknowledging a paper I had authored and the collaborative project I had led. My chest swelled with an odd mix of relief and anticipation. I knew my parents would be notified. I knew the ripple would reach them. It would be another key, another small turn. The crescendo would not be a single shattering moment of triumph. It would be a series of locks opening, steadily and inevitably, until the narrative they'd clung to could no longer be sustained. As I stood in the shadow of that plaque later, fingers tracing the engraved letters, I understood how far I'd come. The notebook spread like a battlefield map on my floor that autumn evening had become a ledger of strategy and endurance. The weapons I'd compiled, documents, witness statements, public acknowledgments, and the steady accumulation of reputation, were not tools of cruelty. They were instruments of truth, turned with gentle but irreversible force. Outside, the late autumn wind carried leaves along the street, clusters of small things moving in a current they could not resist. Inside, I breathed and felt the power of long patience, of deliberate action, and of a promise fulfilled. The life I had built, finally visible, finally undeniable. The plan was nearly complete. Every subtle maneuver, every carefully timed revelation, every evidence-backed statement had been prepared. Soon, the moment would arrive where their assumptions, their neglect, and their dismissals would be laid bare. Not through confrontation, but through the unstoppable weight of truth. And when that moment came, the daughter they had tried to suppress would rise uncontainable, and they would finally understand the consequences of underestimating her. The day finally arrived. It was an overcast autumn afternoon, the kind where the sunlight seemed filtered through a pale haze, softening edges and casting long, deliberate shadows across familiar streets. The family gathering had been planned for months, a celebration for a distant relative, but in my parents' minds, it was more than that. It was an opportunity, a stage, a moment to display their meticulous orchestration of our family, to show off Ethan, the golden child, and to reassure anyone who cared to notice that their eldest daughter had grown exactly as they had expected, obedient, polite, and unremarkable. Invitations had gone out weeks prior, and the guest list was a curated tapestry of relatives, neighbors, family friends, and acquaintances who had, over the years, lauded Ethan's every minor success while glancing past my quiet diligence. They had assembled the audience for a spectacle in which I was meant to play a part already written for me. I chose to arrive later than expected, letting them prepare the stage, settle the narrative, and imagine themselves in complete control. I dressed deliberately. A simple, elegant dress that exuded refinement without extravagance. understated jewelry that hinted at thoughtfulness rather than wealth, and shoes that made no sound beyond the subtle click of confidence. My hair was neat, my posture immaculate, and my steps measured with the calm assurance that comes not from arrogance, but from preparation. I carried nothing in my hands but the invisible weight of years of planning, struggle, and quiet, unacknowledged triumphs. When I entered, the room subtly shifted. I did not demand attention. I did not make a statement of arrival. But the presence of someone fully prepared, fully formed, and quietly self-assured is impossible to ignore. The chatter softened for an instant. Conversations hung mid-air as heads turned, curious, polite, unsure. My parents greeted me with tight smiles, carefully orchestrated gestures meant to convey, "See, she's exactly as we expected." I returned their gestures with measured warmth, polite nods, and subtle acknowledgement. Everything was precise, friendly enough to maintain the illusion of compliance, distant enough to assert control over my own space. The conversation started lightly, as expected. Relatives discussed mundane matters, old stories, shared memories, and, inevitably, Ethan's recent minor achievements, a small job promotion, a sports award, a community recognition. They spoke animatedly, expecting the audience to mirror their admiration. I listened carefully, absorbing each word, each subtle inflection, each chance to interject with a moment of quiet revelation. Timing, I reminded myself, was as crucial as content. A misstep would be noticeable. A carefully placed revelation, however, could undo decades of assumptions in a single moment. I began slowly. My voice was steady, calm, precise, a deliberate contrast to the casual chatter of the room. I spoke of a conference I had attended, a problem I had solved that had garnered international recognition. I did not embellish, did not dramatize, did not add adjectives designed to impress. I simply presented facts, the challenge, my approach, the outcome. The room reacted almost immediately, though in subtle, barely audible ways. Conversations paused. Murmurs shifted. Eyes initially caught in polite attention to Ethan began to wander toward me. A cousin tilted his head. A neighbor's brow lifted. My parents' expressions tightened imperceptibly, the small fissures in their facade beginning to show. I layered my accomplishments carefully, one after the other, each statement strategically placed to build momentum without appearing as boasting. Leadership roles, awards, publications, scholarships, collaborative projects, they were not presented as trophies to elicit admiration, but as undeniable markers of a reality my parents had chosen to ignore. The cumulative effect was quiet but devastating. Where Ethan had been the center of attention, my presence now shifted the room's gravitational pull. Murmurs grew into genuine interest. Polite glances evolved into acknowledgement, and the narrative my parents had controlled for years began to unravel in slow motion. The subtle unveiling of proof followed naturally. Letters and recommendations my parents had dismissed, research projects completed under the weight of their skepticism, countless nights spent under dim lamplight while they assumed I was idle. All of these were woven seamlessly into anecdotes, carefully worded statements, and references to tangible outcomes. The room's energy changed palpably. Relatives leaned in, exchanged subtle nods, and whispered quietly, absorbing a truth that had long been invisible. No one needed to shout. No one needed to argue. The force of undeniable reality had a power that confrontation never could. I watched my parents closely. My father's eyes, once steady, now flickered with uncertainty. The corners of his mouth tightened in a way that betrayed the discomfort he could not suppress. My mother's warmth, always practiced, began to falter, replaced by hesitation, the slightest tremor in her polite smile betraying her growing awareness. Every assumption they had made about me, the obedient, manageable girl they had assumed existed, was being dismantled quietly, efficiently, and without spectacle. And I allowed it to unfold without interference. The most effective revenge I had learned is patience wrapped in inevitability. Then, at the precise moment, I approached them. My steps were measured, my posture still impeccable, my voice soft yet firm, calm, almost gentle, but with the weight of certainty behind it. Every word I spoke carried the gravity of years of meticulous effort, study, and planning. "You thought stopping me from learning would limit me," I said. You thought keeping me in the shadows would keep me small, but I learned everything you denied me, and I built a life you cannot touch." The room fell into a hush. Every pair of eyes, previously occupied with polite conversation, now fixated on me. The tension was palpable, an almost tangible energy that pressed softly into the silence. Relatives' faces reflected shock, curiosity, and admiration, while my parents remained frozen, a mixture of pride, disbelief, and a dawning recognition of their miscalculation. My father's hand tightened around the stem of his glass. My mother's mouth parted slightly as though struggling to speak, but no words came. I allowed the pause to extend deliberately, letting every syllable resonate fully. I did not raise my voice. I did not seek confrontation. I did not demand apologies. The strength of the moment lay in its quiet inevitability. Their illusion of control, maintained for decades, collapsed under the simple weight of observable, undeniable truth. Every neglect, every subtle preference for Ethan, every word that had implied limitation, all of it confronted them silently, yet unmistakably. The room, filled with witnesses, confirmed the reality my parents had tried to deny. I had not only grown, but I had exceeded all expectation in a life they thought they controlled. Then I turned and walked away. Each step was measured, graceful, and deliberate. The silence behind me was deafening, a quiet punishment more precise than any outburst could have been. Their punishment had been delivered, not through spectacle, not through argument, not through recrimination, but through the weight of an undeniable life built in spite of them. The truth, embodied in me, needed no embellishment. I had constructed an argument they could not refute and would never be able to unsee. In the weeks that followed, the shift became permanent. Their words carried hesitation where once there had been certainty. No amount of persuasion, strict guidance, or subtle manipulation could undo what was now evident. Invitations to speak, recognition in professional circles, articles praising my work, all of it poured into the world steadily, undeniably, and visibly. My parents observed it in silence, a quiet witness to the life they had attempted to shape but could never control. I often revisited the memory of those nights spent under a dim desk lamp, when the candle flickered against notebooks full of problems solved, letters of correspondence, and borrowed textbooks. Each hour was a quiet act of rebellion, a building block of eventual triumph. Dreams cannot be chained, knowledge cannot be suppressed, and underestimated daughters, when patient and strategic, can craft revenge more precise and devastating than any impulsive act. The meticulous accumulation of evidence, skill, and accomplishment ensures that the consequences are not temporary but permanent. Each new success became a reinforcement of the inevitability they had tried to deny. Praise from peers, quiet acknowledgement from colleagues, subtle recognition in social circles. All were gentle yet undeniable reminders that underestimation had been their greatest mistake. Every time a relative asked for my advice, every time a professional contact sought collaboration, it was a reinforcement of the quiet power that patience and strategy could cultivate. And I grew more than accomplished. I grew free. I had done more than succeed. I had become someone no one could control, someone who could define her own trajectory, someone whose life could not be scripted by the narrow assumptions of others. My parents, while still my parents, could only watch and adapt, unable to dismantle the reality I had carefully constructed. The satisfaction was unlike any other. It was not the thrill of anger, the fleeting satisfaction of a shouted argument, or the temporary joy of confrontation. It was the calm, measured release that comes from knowing the truth has been made undeniable, that every careful step, every quiet effort, every strategic choice had culminated in an outcome they could not ignore. It was justice delivered not through spectacle, but through the deliberate accumulation of merit and undeniable proof. On quiet evenings, when the world outside was dim and still, I would sometimes trace my finger across the edge of my journal, recalling the years of quiet labor, of stolen hours, of nights when knowledge was my only ally. Every success since then, every recognition, every invitation and acknowledgement carried with it the memory of those struggles, and the silent joy that I had transformed suppression into power, neglect into strategy, and doubt into certainty. The crescendo of that day, the family gathering, the quiet revelation, the slow dismantling of their assumptions, was only the beginning. Each subsequent acknowledgement, each subtle victory, reinforced the inevitability that had been built over years of meticulous planning. The lesson was clear. Power lies in patience. Revenge is most effective when quiet, and the underestimated, when strategic and patient, can achieve an unstoppable triumph. In the quiet aftermath, I understood fully that my life was no longer theirs to shape, no longer confined by old expectations. I had achieved the rarest form of freedom. Not just success, but the irreversible knowledge that I had built it entirely on my own terms. Every whispered acknowledgement, every nod of recognition from the world beyond their narrow gaze, was a confirmation that their attempt to control me had failed. And in that understanding, I found not bitterness, but the calm, unshakable satisfaction of absolute, undeniable triumph. Looking back, the journey wasn't just about revenge. It was about survival, resilience, and reclaiming what was mine all along. I had been underestimated, dismissed, and confined, but every slight, every small dismissal, every night spent in secret study became the foundation for a life they could never touch. Revenge, I learned, doesn't have to be violent or vengeful. It can be elegant, precise, and unavoidable. And the sweetest part? Watching the truth quietly unfold before those who never believed in you. If this story resonated with you, hit that like button and subscribe for more tales of perseverance, justice, and subtle revenge. Share this with someone who's ever been underestimated. And tell me, where are you watching from? Drop your city and local time in the comments. I want to hear who's listening as these stories unfold.